This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by Isotope, Atom Audio, Native Instruments, Lewitt, Spectra 1964, and OWC. You're hearing my voice right now on the Lewitt Pure Tube microphone through the Spectra 1964 STX 100D mic pre and C610 complementer mixed with Isotope RX, Ozone, Neutron, and Nectar, all recorded safely onto an OWC SSD and mixed on Atom Audio monitors. Please check out our awesome sponsors using the link in the show notes. It's a great way for you to help support this show. Now get ready to rock.
Regardless of your DAW, you have plenty of stock plugins that all sound wonderful. And just start with your stock EQ and your stock compressor. And when you can get a mix that sounds clean, balanced, with clarity and some excitement consistently, well, then we can start talking about what plugins or tools do you want to use to give it a different sound.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. My studio is proudly powered by OWC, and I love how it's improved my workflow. OWC can connect all your audio work drives, trackballs, mix controllers, MIDI keyboards, audio interfaces, displays, or cameras so that you can work fast and focus on making your best record ever. Go look at the Mini Stack STX, Thunder Bay 4, or Gemini Thunderbolt 3 dock at macsales.com/rockstars to find the perfect solution for your studio from OWC. And thanks for using our custom link in the show notes. Howdy, rock stars. I've got a secret to tell you about how I get a consistent sound mixing over 1,000 hours of recording Studio Rockstars. My secret is using Isotope, RX, Ozone, Neutron, and Nectar to make this podcast sound great. Right now, you're hearing RX breath control, declick, declip, DS, deplosive, voice denoise, Ozone multiband compression, Neutron EQ, and limiting, all from Isotope. Go to isotope.com and use the secret code ROCK10 to get 10% off. Howdy, rock stars. It's your host, Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is David Vignola, a professional audio mixing engineer with over 20 years of experience who has mixed and mastered music for hundreds of artists all around the world. He's been in studios all over the country, working in many analog and digital hybrid studio setups. He's also studied under the mixing engineer Michael White, whose credits include the Rolling Stones, Whitney Houston, Kiss, and the Talking Heads, to name just a few. Over the last decade, David decided to start giving back by helping musicians and engineers learn the craft of audio engineering. He found that teaching was something he really enjoyed that led him to create homerecordingmadeeasy.com, and now, following that, mixingmadeeasy.net. His main focus is on the beginner, intermediate recording musician and aspiring audio engineer to help students improve their recording and engineering skills. I've known David for a few years, I think, and I've really enjoyed watching David's YouTube videos when I'm just going across YouTube myself and checking him out. I think he's doing fantastic work, and I highly recommend that you check out David's YouTube channels, Rockstars, and his courses and teaching. But I'm very excited to have him here to join us on the podcast. We're going to dive into topics of home studio, mixing, recording, pretty much anything that we feel like talking about that's going to help you in your studio make your best record ever. So please welcome David Vignola to Recording Studio Rockstars. David, my friend, are you ready to rock, dude?
I am. Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this. So I listen to your podcast all the time. So now I feel like I've upgraded myself a little bit. Now I'm in with a lot of good company because I know you talk to a lot of people and a lot of serious people. So I'm just honored that you asked me to come on. So this is going to be a lot of fun.
Right on, man. Well, it's an honor to have you here, dude. Again, you're a great teacher. I think one of the ways that I would describe you is very genuine and down to earth in a way. Like I see a lot of stuff that's on YouTube. I mean, I do it myself, but we can really get pulled into these kind of flashy, bright, flashing lights and shiny objects ways of interacting with the internet and through YouTube and other things. And I always appreciate it when I see somebody like yourself who kind of keeps it centered and just teaches really valuable stuff and really stays down to earth and very matter of fact about the stuff you're teaching and you're talking about. One of the things that I notice you doing is even going out of your way to let your audience know that, you're going to give an honest opinion about these different gears and product for the studio that you review, stuff like that. So anyway, I dig your style, man.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, no, I try to. You're right. There's a lot of great in our space here. There's only maybe a dozen channels that everybody seems to watch. I know there's a lot more out there, but the main ones. And I just try to be different. They're all great. They all do awesome stuff. But I'm not as talented in the video editing as they are, and I'm not as flashy as they are, and I'm not as good on camera as some of those guys. So I just try to approach my videos like if we were sitting in a room together and we were talking about whatever it is, a piece of gear or mixing or whatever, and we were just talking like friends, and I'm just trying to say, if you said to me, teach me this, I just try to talk to you like a person, and that's how I try to come across, because with all the stuff I have going on, I also don't have the time to do the slick video edits and all of that. And I'm a one-man show. I don't have assistants. I don't have teams of people. So I just try to just do it off the cuff. And I just, warts and all, and you either like it or you don't like it.
Nice. Well, that may sound familiar to many of us who are just making our own music and recording in our own studios too. I mean, it's like, there's an element of making music in a home studio that is just a passion for how much fun it is. We can be, awful self-critics at times, but other times we can just be our own biggest fan,
Right.
And for me personally, making the music in the home studio is where all the fun is. And if it turns out great, awesome. If it's got bumps on it, I don't care. I just want to have a lot of fun and do my best to make it sound great.
Right.
But tell us more about yourself. So you have had a lot of experience making records, and then you sort of have also at some point you sort of pivoted to the teaching. I guess according to your bio, about a decade ago, right?
Yeah, it's probably, that bio should be up there. It's probably 12, 13 years by this point, but the teaching kind of happened totally by accident, to be totally honest. The way it kind of happened is I worked, like a lot of us did, started off in studios as an intern in my local state and was, learned as a tracking engineer and then, mostly as an assistant wrapping cables, setting up microphones, that whole thing. And at the same time, I was a musician, guitar player in a band, and I would work there to get free studio time to record our band's demos and those kinds of things. And then when the commercial rooms started to dwindle, and as the technology became more accessible to the home user, and the record industry changed, and everything started to happen in the big rooms, started to close down. I decided to build my own home studio, and at the time, my wife and I just bought a house, and we finished the basement and all of that. And then I would just bring bands in to track. And that's how it started. And then what happened was the budgets got really small. There wasn't any money. And I started finding out that, at least in my area, I know you're out in, I think, Tennessee, but in Connecticut, there's not lines of people waiting to come into studios to record, and when the ones that want to come in, they want to come in and they want to work 8 or 10 hours and they only want to pay a couple of $100, which doesn't even keep the lights on, the lights on in the room. Right. So I started to say, wow, what am I going to do? And I had, at the same time, I had some bandmates and friends that were asking me to help teach them, because I always ran the PA. I always learned all the geeky stuff. I would record our bands out live when you didn't have the nice digital mixer where everything was at the touch of the button and you could multi-track record, when you actually had to bring a trailer full of equipment to the show in order to record the band.
When you actually had to own the PA.
Yeah, own the PA and all the DI boxes and everything else. So that I was teaching people how to do that, and then teaching people how to mix, and all that stuff, because I was mixing our own recordings, and I really found it enjoyable. And I think someone had said to me at one time, have you ever considered, putting out an online course and teaching this stuff? And I knew nothing about that kind of stuff. I was like, no, I didn't even have a YouTube channel at the time. I didn't really get into the internet thing. I said, no. And I said, well, put out a course. How do I do that? Who cares what I have to say? Who's going to buy a course from me? And someone had convinced me to just try it. They said, put out a course, just put something out and see what happens. So I built this back then, a really cheap free website, I think on GoDaddy. And I made a beginner's mixing course, like a little 90-minute thing. And I called it, my wife and I said, well, what do we call this thing? I was like, well, I don't know, and this was before, again, you couldn't search online and find a mixing course and have 500 creators that offer something. There was nobody really, unless you were a big name, no one really did that kind of stuff back then. And my wife, and we were just bouncing around the names, and my wife came up with, well, what is it supposed to be? And I said, well, it's for beginners. It's supposed to make it so it's really simple and easy. She goes, why don't you call it Mixing Made Easy?
Nice.
And I said, oh, yeah, okay. Good thing I got a smart wife. And so I put this course up online. I had a couple of friends that was helping me learn a new DAW, and one of them was doing a live stream. And he said, well, why don't you come on my live stream and I'll introduce you to my audience, which was like maybe 50 people or so at the time. I said, sure. We talked about the course, kind of like we're doing now. And I put it up for sale. And at the time I sold it for, I think, $15 because I didn't think anybody would buy it. I think it was a Friday night. By Saturday afternoon, you know how you get notifications on your phone every time you get a sale? Through PayPal, I would get a notification. Right. And we're sitting in the living room watching TV, and also my phone is dinging. It's like ding, 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 ding. And I'm looking at my phone. It's going PayPal, PayPal, PayPal. And I'm going, that can't be right. Someone must have hacked my account. Something's wrong. Can't believe it. And we sold, I don't even know how many, hundreds of copies in the first 3 or 4 days of having this thing out there. And I was like, I couldn't believe it. I was like, what? In the way, my courses today now are much more, they're a little more well-produced, and I'm a little bit more comfortable on camera. But back then, when we had a cheap little webcam, and I'd never been on camera before, I'd never taught anything before in a course format. It wasn't scripted or anything, but I was shocked. So my wife was saying, hey, you were just saying that you can't get people in the studio here anymore. They don't want to pay any money. There's no more budgets. What about teaching people? You got the internet, the whole world's accessible to you. And that was kind of the seed of how it started. And then from there, I came up with a website, and we called it Home Recording Made Easy. From Mixing Made Easy, we said, and I was shocked that homerecordingmadeeasy.com was an available domain. I couldn't believe it. I said that.
Right.
I kind of just stumbled. So it wasn't a well thought out thing. I just kind of stumbled into it. And once I started to do it, and I said, okay, well, if they like the Mixing Made Easy course, maybe I'll do a course on EQ and a course on compression. And it just started to build. And
yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
I
bet that name would be available today only if you removed all the vowels and like doubled all the consonants or some crazy shit, right?
I was shocked. And so I got kind of lucky, and I kind of stumbled into it. And that's when I started the YouTube channel, and it just, and now 12 years later, I'm sitting here and we have a whole online school, multiple websites, and it's just grown, and it's all been organic. I don't pay for any advertising. There's no ads. Everything is done organically.
That's great, man.
And so, so it's been great.
I love hearing success stories like that. And especially when they're just, a genuine, honest one, which is like, you just decided to try and, help. I mean, I think even all of us who are listening, we all have some level of knowledge that somebody else we know doesn't have. And we all get this opportunity to just teach, like, oh, no, this is how you use Pro Tools or Logic or Studio One or whatever. And it's fun, and it's cool. And it's awesome to see that you guys have been able to create such a cool thing. So tell us a little bit more about it. So what do you today, if somebody, came up to you and they're like, yeah, I play guitar, what do you do? What would you say? I'm
an online educator for audio production, everything from recording, mixing, and mastering in the home studio environment. I mean, I know it sounds really fancy, but I've been asked that question so many times, it just kind of rolls off the tongue at this point. Yeah. And that's what I do. So, I'm a mixing engineer. I still mix for clients. I have a big console behind me, which we could talk about later if you want. I have another brand beyond these two that we're talking about tonight. But the core of my business is online education through the homerecordingmadeeasy.com school,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Now, I will say that I think I know for a fact, actually, that the majority of the rock stars in our audience are recording themselves at home, in their home studios. So, I know we're all at different levels of knowledge, but just like me, I think everybody's motivated to want to pick up a guitar and write that better song. And, maybe record it all themselves, or maybe record it with their bandmates or their friends, or maybe find people to work with over the internet. And also I think you and I come from a bit of an old school mentality too. We're probably, bands have drums and bass and two guitars in them and keyboards and singing and vocals and acoustic guitars. But at the same time, I love all the electronic stuff and I love the programming and the synths and everything. But most of my songs would probably start with a guitar first.
Mine as well. Right. Right. Mine as well.
Yeah. So what are some of the, let's keep talking about your studio for just a sec, because we'll have plenty of time to get into the rest of it too. So you say you got a big console behind you. I've seen that in your videos. What is the console that you got?
So that's an SSL Origin. It's a 32 channel full inline console. They released it, I believe, right before COVID is when it came out. And that's when I started another brand that kind of branched off of Home Recording Made Easy. And so we have a console and a bunch of hardware and another YouTube channel called Mixing Music Analog, which was an extension of Home Recording Made Easy. I can tell you how that all came about at one point if you want to know. But it was strategic. A lot of people think I just ran out and bought a console, but there was some thought, there was some method to the madness, as crazy as it sounds.
Were you getting a lot of requests from people to understand, how to get out of the box and mix more with analog?
Yeah, not a ton of requests. But what really happened was Home Recording Made Easy, the core audience, 60% of the audience are really beginners. People that are just getting into digital recording. Most of my audience is between the ages of 30 and 60, and they recorded in the analog days like we did. And so a lot of my students are now in the retired years. And now they go, I want to record at home. I got this computer I use for email, but how in the world do you record music into it? I'm used to that.
Yeah.
But then the other 40%, I'd say about 20% of those people are people that are more in the intermediate stages. They're in the box, they're working in the box, but they know how to get an audio signal into their Pro Tools rig, and they know how to make songs with a combination of instruments and things like Easy Drummer and Superior Drummer and those kinds of things. But now they want to know how to make them sound good with plugins. And then the other 20% are people that either are more advanced or who have started at the beginning stages with me, and over the last 10 years have now graduated to more where, what's this whole thing about hybrid? And what's the difference? What does a hardware master bus compressor do that the plugin doesn't? Or does it do something the plugin doesn't? That kind of thing.
Yeah, or they're looking to level up somehow.
So what I found was I started to say, okay, let me get into a little bit more advanced stuff. So I'm not just doing beginner stuff to cater to that percentage of audience, because that percentage is smaller, but it was continuing to grow, which is a good thing. When I started to introduce just a couple of pieces of hardware into the Home Recording Made Easy brand and channel, it got really rejected by most of the audience, because most of my audience, as I said, didn't want that. They're like, I'm not buying a $3,000 master bus compressor, Dave. I'm using my stock plugins.
Sorry, Uncle Dave.
Uncle Dave, right?
Uncle Dave is referring to yourself on your channel.
Yeah, everyone's, I don't know, they called me that and I just kind of stuck. So I said, okay, well, how do I reach a more advanced type of audience that either are at that level, have their own project studios, maybe are somewhat hybrid, and even some people that might be in the market for a console or have a console or whatever. So I said, I don't want to muddy the waters at Home Recording Made Easy. Let me start another YouTube channel and brand and website where I can feature my more professional mixing services as well as education. And that's where the YouTube channel Mixing Music Analog came from. So it kind of bridged the gap. So Home Recording Made Easy goes beginners all the way through intermediate, advanced in the box, and then Mixing Music Analog kind of picks up where that left off to where now we're talking about all the shiny, fun stuff that everybody likes. And that was the whole business model around it. People think I went out to do that so I could be a full-time mixing engineer. I'm like, I don't want to be a full-time mixing engineer. I want to do education. And then the byproduct of that is Now, because I have this stuff, it attracts artists that want to have their stuff mixed analog that they can't do themselves. And what's
Yeah.
about that for me is I can handpick the projects that I work on. So when I did the business plan, or at least the way I told my wife I did the business plan, is I said, if I never had a paying client on my SSL, okay, because I'll have content, training courses around it, YouTube and ad money, hopefully down the road. Maybe I'll get lucky at one point, have some sponsorship, and that will pay for this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But if I get some mixing clients, that's great. I could be selective about the projects I feel passionate about and want to help people. And because I don't need to mix for money, I could keep the rates reasonable, and I can get involved in projects where maybe I can help people and expose some artists that may not get that exposure another way. And also they can have their stuff mixed, on gear that they don't have, or they don't have access to.
Yeah, I found myself feeling similar about my studio over the years. When I started a home studio, I had come from the world of sort of the major, chasing the major label, golden ring or whatever. And when I did the home studio, I found that it was really enjoyable to work with independent artists. I mean, I've still had lots of opportunity to do more high profile stuff, but there's something really enjoyable about just keeping a studio sort of relaxed and working with people you just enjoy working with, and helping people make records where, there's a real sense of accomplishment.
Yeah. And also too, that there's no pressure for me, because the way I kind of built this up over the years, there's no pressure for me to go out. I have to make a certain amount of money every month to pay a certain amount of, overhead. It doesn't. I built these home recording made easy brand where that's my main business, and it'll always continue to be my main business. This was more of a labor of love, a passion project, and I've been doing it now 2 years, and it's just now breaking even. The first 2 years I lost money. I mean, I spent a ton of money, but now it just got to the point where, it pays for itself every month. And I said, hey, I'm okay. And if it makes money down the road, or who knows where it goes, great. But this way, now I have something for everybody. I got someone who's never plugged in an audio interface into their computer before, all the way up through someone who goes out and invests in a console that has a studio, wants to know how to install it, wants to know how to use it, wants to know what the differences are between working with plugins and hardware, because as you know, it's completely different, not better, just different. And how, if someone wants to move into that hybrid, they have another source of education. Because when I bought my console, I learned very quickly that there is nobody on YouTube showing you how to install consoles and how to install all this stuff.
Yeah.
Nobody. And so we did it, and it worked.
Do you remember the first time you ever saw a patch bay?
Yes. Yes.
I remember it scared the crap out of me.
It did. Yeah, it did. And I know how to use one. And when we went to install this one, it still scared the crap out of me, even though I know how to use them, because it's, the amount of cables that were required to do this kind of stuff scared the daylights out of me. But it's been a ton of fun, and it's the YouTube channel is small. It's only got 7,000 subscribers or something, but we're growing. But what we do have on that channel, even though it's smaller, is we have a smaller audience, but a very engaged audience. And for the amount of subscribers we have, we get lots of views, and we get lots and lots of comments on our videos. And they're mostly positive, which in today's world is a miracle. So
one more time, just before we continue on, reiterate for our listeners who are at the beginning stage, middle stage, or that sort of more advanced stage, what are the 3 places of yours they should go check out?
Okay, so if you're on YouTube, Home Recording Made Easy, the YouTube channel is if you're in the box, beginner through intermediate kind of stuff. Everything from recording, mixing, mastering, EQ, compression, there's a whole bunch of stuff. The website, homerecordingmadeeasy.com, is all the training courses around those topics that you see at the YouTube channel. When you want to get into more higher level stuff, analog hybrid stuff, you want to go to the YouTube channel, Mixing Music Analog. Okay, and that's where that is. And everything's all backlinked and stuff. So if you're on one and you want it, it's all linked, you'll be able to find the other. But I made the brands completely different color schemes, everything, because again, the Home Recording Made Easy audience got upset when I started to bring in the more higher level stuff, or more expensive gear.
People.
They don't want to, and they were right. It was the right thing, was the wrong thing to try to do at the time.
Cool, man. All right. Well, so let's see. Let's start jumping in and talk about this stuff a little more. So you've got the Origin SSL console there. I've noticed that some of your videos, you've also got the PreSonus Studio Live board.
I do.
And I think to be quite honest, you've reviewed so many different cool products for our studios. You probably have a little bit of everything, or have tried everything.
Yeah, I got a lot of stuff. The Studio Live was the last one. We were using it more for people who were asking me about DAW controllers. And so over the last 18 months, I've been fortunate enough to work with Sweetwater, where I just said, hey, can you send me one of these and one of these and one of the, and we've been doing them. And we've done almost every major DAW controller on the market, with the exception of the Avid stuff. And the only reason why we haven't done the Avid stuff is because it's so, from a price perspective, it is so above and beyond the cost of the other ones. And for where most of my audience is going to spend, they're not going to spend $3,000 on an 8-channel DAW controller. They're just not.
Yeah.
But we've done all the other ones, and I've, compared them all. What are the features? Which ones, what do I like about them? What I don't like about them? Walking them through the basic features. So that's been pretty popular. And the Studio Live was the last one that we did.
Atom Audio can provide all your monitor needs, whether you're setting up a first-time home studio for recording music or podcasts, or a world-class full-size studio for professional mixing and mastering in stereo or immersive sound. Featuring the XART tweeter and custom DSP onboard processing, the A-series monitors will perfectly adapt to your studio. Get the Atom Audio monitors and subwoofers that are right for you with an extended 5-year warranty at atomaudio.com. Hey Rockstars, have you checked out Native Instruments recently? Look, no matter what style of music you make, Native Instruments gives your studio everything you need, from drums, loops, and beats to the coolest synths, realistic strings, guitar amps, and futuristic synth pads. I personally love recording and tracking real bands in my studio, but then also adding awesome overdubs from Battery, Contact, Massive X, Super 8, Guitar Rig, and Hybrid Keys, for example. Go pick up Complete Start for free today with a bundle of 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of samples over at nativeinstruments.com and use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off. Some restrictions apply. Yeah, so I've had experience on the Studio Live. We took the series to Studio Live 64 down to Bonnaroo, to my Haybell studio, and I mixed live bands in the studio for a few years that way, and it was pretty cool. I mean, it took a little getting used to. It's different than mixing on an analog console. You kind of have to, I had to slow my roll just a little bit. Like on an analog, you just grab the knob and go.
Right.
On a digital one, I had to like go park my finger on the edge of the console, then hit the right select button, pause for a split second, and then grab the EQ, But it was I was really impressed with how quickly you can mix working that way. And then I have explored the Avid controllers, the S1s, and I thought they were pretty cool. I ran into a few, there were things that were cool about them. Then there were things where like, we were joking, you and I were joking about how when you've done this for a while, you realize that you're like, okay, everything worked in the studio today. Okay, everything doesn't work in the studio tomorrow. Oh, it works again the next day.
Right.
And I was running into some of those issues a little bit. But more recently, I put in the SSL UF8 and a pair of those in the UC1. And I've really been loving how that works. It's a slightly different way of thinking about how to use a controller with Pro Tools. In my case, I know I think you use Studio One most of the time.
Yeah, most of the time. I have all of them for client work, but I try to stay in Studio One, and the UF8 and the UC1, we did those too, and those were great. Those were two of my favorites. Out of all of them I tried, I felt like that, at least with Studio One, was pretty intuitive. And the thing I like about, and the thing that all these DAW controllers don't get right, with the exception of the UC1 and maybe Soft Tube Console One, is the thing that you do in the DAW the most. The thing you do the absolute most is opening and closing plugin windows and tweaking plugin parameters. Yeah. And none of these controllers, because of the nature of all the different variety of plugins and stuff, I get it. None of them do plugin control really well. They will all do them and you can map things, but they're all kind of clunky. No one really gets it right. The UC1 gets it right, but the problem is you can only use the SSL channel strip with it. So, I mean, there's some trade-off. So no one has really come up with a plugin controller that really works well, because that's not really what those things are. They're really more for the faders and for the transport system. But I found the UF8 and the UC1 to be my favorite combination out of all of them.
Yeah, I agree. The limitation I ran into with it wasn't about the SSL stuff. It was the limitation that it's the roadblock that Pro Tools puts in front of you with the Huey protocol.
Yeah, right.
Where it really just doesn't let controllers talk that deeply to Pro Tools.
Right.
But what really kind of blew me away is the way SSL was creating this 360 app that sort of interfaces. And then if you do that layer, now all of a sudden the UF8, you just touch a fader. And it's like, you don't even have to look up. You know that the UC1 is that EQ. You know, you just touch the bass fader and your EQ in the bass. And to me, that's like a really cool feature of being able to use a good controller mixing in the box. Or that would be the cool feature of mixing on a console.
Right. And that's what I think they're trying to do, right? They were trying to give you that experience that you're kind of working on an SSL console. And it's the closest thing to it. I mean, I have both. So I know, the controller is built really well. The knobs and everything feel like my console. They're laid out in the same order. You look down at it and it looks like an SSL channel strip. That's what it is. Yeah. So it does a really good job as far as that's concerned. But again, the whole thought process, if you're working on a console, regardless of what brand it is, that you just have that. I mean, you don't have 500 plugin choices like you do in the DAW. So they're trying to say, look, you work with our channel strip, you're working on an SSL in the box. And that's kind of what they're trying to do. And if you're into that, it's a great piece of gear for sure.
Yeah. Now, to me, the number one frustration when mixing in the box, other than, having to click with a mouse and stuff like that, which I always equate to having to learn how to play guitar with the tip of a sharpened pencil. You're like,
good point.
How do you play guitar like that? It doesn't make sense. But so, the big frustration is you go to open a plugin and then you start adjusting it and you're adjusting the wrong track, the wrong plugin. It's like the most common thing in the world.
Right.
And so it's nice when the controllers start to make it so that you don't have to have that happen. But I thought a good thing to remind the Rockstars of, because it's always compared to mixing on a console where it's like you go to turn the EQ on the console and you can't be turning the wrong EQ. Well, the truth is, Rockstars, and David, I think you would agree with me, there's plenty of times I've reached up to our console and grabbed the wrong EQ. You still have to like visually, center, okay, I'm on the bass and I'll zip my hand up the console and find the EQ on that track.
Yeah, because everything's all kind of crunched together. Believe me, I've done that a million times. So you're not looking up at the screen, but you're still kind of got to look where you're going. It's not totally heads down, don't look. It's not like that. It's not like that. But yeah, so I like that. I like that SSL product. I think it's a really good product. It's built really well, and it is one of the more, next to the Avid, it's one of the more expensive ones on the market. But as I said in the videos when I reviewed them all, but it's built better. It feels better. It's a little more intuitive. It has that, SSL kind of feel to it. You put your hands on an SSL product and it feels professional. It doesn't feel cheap or chintzy or clunky. And so if you're going to charge 2.5 times the money, it should be that. And it is. It truly is. And so, if I had to pick one, I would pick the UF8 with the UC1 as a combination. That would be mine. But I haven't tried the Avid stuff, so I don't know if that's any better. But my guess would be it's probably good in some areas and probably not so good in others. So like most of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you go down that road, if you want to have the EQ features and the compression features, then you have to go to the high level stuff. We're going back to the old command, decommand desks, which were like, as my friend who owns one pointed out, it was $100,000 mouse that he bought for his studio.
Right. And now the new one, like the S6, I think Michael Brower or someone has one, and it's like 140 grand, but it looks beautiful. I mean, I could understand that if you're an in-the-box guy and you want all the feeling of a real console, but you want all the benefits of recall and automation and all the stuff that the digital brings, one of those big desks are awesome. But now you're in this territory. You're in six-figure mark to get that.
Well, we don't have to. I mean, that's sort of almost a non-conversation because I don't think we're going to go grab that. But I do think you're right. Being really attentive to the stuff that our audience is most likely to actually go look at. So I do think the S1 is in that ballpark. SSL, UF8, UC1. I think I'm not always as attentive to the price point as you are. So as you pointed out, they're a little more. Then I think you did a review of the Behringer.
I just did that one.
Well.
Yeah, I did that one, and that's the least expensive of the group that we've done over the last 18 months. And again, it's pretty good. It was built better than I thought it would be. I said that in the video. I have one more video coming out next week where I say some of these things, but it was built better than I thought it was going to be. A lot of the things that were positive about the others this had, and there's a few things about it that were kind of, where they missed the mark. But again, it's literally, if you look at compared to the SSL product, it's a third of the price.
Yeah.
So you really couldn't expect, sometimes people don't realize, so you really can't expect the quality, the feature set of the SSL stuff in a product that's a third of the price. I mean, there's a reason why it's a third of the price. It's not a bad product, but it's a reason. So I try to bring stuff at different price points because everybody's on a budget. And so maybe they want the SSL thing, but they can't afford $1,300. But you know what? $500 and they can get 80% of the features. That's good enough for their studio. And so, so that's a good product as well. For the price, I think it's great.
I think anybody who's playing guitar out there and listening to this understands that you can get a cheap version of a guitar. It may not play as nicely as the nicer one. So there's always a value for which one you choose,
Right.
Granted, there are some things that we run into that are, overpriced, and we run into that. And there are some really sweet deals that we run into too. So it's really a great service that you provide, helping people kind of sort through that stuff. Because every time I'm considering something for my studio, I'm just like everybody. I go over to YouTube and I just start
me too.
just digging through videos, and I'll be like, God, I just wish I could find, somebody who just is normal in using it, and that's when I like finding your stuff. Maddie Harris is another guest on the show over at Mix and Master My Song. And I love the way you guys are really down to earth about your reviews. You're like, oh, this is somebody using it the way I would use it in the studio,
Yeah. And the other thing I try to do a little bit different from others, because I don't have the time to spend 3 months with a product and learn every nook and cranny and bring them a full in-depth review. I take the other approach. I said, I want to show you what it's like when we get it out of the box for the first time. I really don't spend more than 5 minutes. I plug it in to make sure it works. And then I turn the camera on and I just go. So if you bought the product, like the X Touch, for example, and you opened it up on your studio desk, how quickly can we get up and running? And how can we navigate through most of the features without having to pull our hair out? That's what I try to do. How easy can you get on with the product, as opposed to using it for 6 months, building all the muscle memory, and then coming back and giving you an in-depth review. There's lots of people that do that, and that's a valuable service as well. I don't have the time to do that, but I want people to know that when you get it home, here's how quickly or not you may find, and here's some of the stumbling blocks you may run into, and here's how you overcome those. So I try to take that approach from it as well. And then the other thing too is a lot of the stuff on YouTube today, and again, I don't say this in a negative way, everyone has to make a living. Most of the stuff is all sponsored. So when you're watching lots of people on YouTube and they never say even a constructive criticism thing about any product because it's given to them and they have to have that relationship and that agreement, believe me, I understand that. They're not as unbiased as I can be. I'm completely unbiased and unfiltered. These companies don't give me the gear. A lot of times I have to return it unless I say it in the video, and sometimes I'll work with Sweetwater, but I have never taken a check or a penny in cash exchange for anything on my channels. Sometimes it is form of payment. I get to keep the gear from Sweetwater. And you know what I do with that gear? I give it to my student at a price that they couldn't even think about getting it at, just to cover my time to make the video. So for example, they used one of the SSLs or the UC1 or whatever we did. I sold that package to a student of mine for less than half of what he would have paid for it new.
Nice.
just because I'll give someone a deal. You're a student of mine. I'll get a few $100 for I did 7 videos of that. So I spent about, three full days of my life making videos for it.
Video production is expensive. I'm
It's,
not sure if people
unbelievable.
understand that.
So I cover some of my time. Someone gets a great deal, and then that way I don't have to be in bed with a company, and I don't have to. I don't care. I'm not going to come on and bash anybody's product. I wouldn't do that. If the product's no good, I'm just going to put it in the box, and there'll never be a video.
There's no point in
no point in that. But I can be super, super honest. And I say in every one of these videos, when we get to the likes, dislikes portion of the video, I usually will have an equal amount of dislikes as I have likes, but they're not showstoppers. They're just, hey, this is what we can improve this, or this is a little clunky. Maybe on the next revision, they can fix this. Or I try to be as honest with people as possible, because there's a lot of people out there that are just on YouTube schlepping gear. And I'm not out there schlepping gear. I don't care whether you buy the stuff or not. I'm just here to share my experience and try to help people. And not that there's not other people doing that. I'm not suggesting I'm the only one that does that, but I know there's a lot of YouTube channels that we all know and love. And I've never hear a negative thing ever said about anything. And then I got to say, well, is it really an honest review? And so that's where I try to take a little bit of a different approach, as opposed to just having trucks of gear being sent to my studio every day. And you know what I mean? I don't do that. And I probably should. Because
I think it's great.
My wife tells me I should probably do that because I probably make a hell of a lot more money. But it's just not my thing. I don't. Yeah. I want to try to help people, not just sell them stuff,
Nice. Well, I think people appreciate that. And so Rockstars, if that's important to you and learning about the stuff that's available for your studio, then definitely want to go check out David's channels for that. Are you recording your own music or other people's music in your studio, but you're having trouble figuring out how to get your mixes to sound great? Do they sound kind of weak or distant or lack punch and clarity? Well, I've got a gift to help you take your mixes from sounding like basement demos to sounding much closer to professional mixes. And it's my free course called Mix Master Bundle. This course will show you how to get pro-sounding mixes from your home studio with free and stock plugins in Pro Tools, and the best part is that these mixing techniques work for you in any DAW, whether you're on Logic, Cubase, Studio One, Reaper, anything you can think of. If you're ready now to make your best record ever, then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now, and you can find the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Let's talk a little bit more about this hybrid mixing, because I know that's sort of a new direction for you. Mm-hmm. What are some of the ways that you describe what your audience discovers when they learn more about hybrid mixing? Is the first question how does it sound different? Essentially, it seems like a pretty fair question.
Yeah, it's the number one topic, number one question I get. But here's what I tell people. It does sound different, and I always use the word different. I never use the word better, and that's where I'm a little different than other people that talk about this topic, is because, and I may think it's better, and you may not think it's better, and neither one of us are wrong. Both of our points are valid. It's all very subjective, and lots of hit records are made all in the box, by the way. So you don't need a bunch of stuff. But here's what I tell people. That question comes up, but the other thing that comes up, and the reason why I really bought this stuff, I wanted a different workflow. It's a way more different tactile kind of a feel, much different than working with a DAW controller, much different than working with plugins. So when you're working in hybrid or analog on a console with gear, there's a tactile feel. And for me, I feel like I'm more part of the music. I'm like part of the performance. It's almost like you're a third or fourth member of the band. The mix becomes a performance. Not that you can't do that in the box, but it's not the same sensation, at least to me. So the workflow and the feel of the way you work is entirely different than working in the box. Now, the DAW controller gets you a little more in that direction, but it isn't the same as working on a console, but it's getting closer. But then the next thing always comes up, well, the sound. Well, does it? And we do on that channel a lot of gear, hardware versus plug-in counterpart comparisons. And again, and I always, just like with, anything else that I do, I give my opinion, but I really try to teach people what to listen for and how they sound different. And so there is a difference when you talk about analog versus digital, there's a big difference. But it doesn't mean one's better. It just means that it's different. And so a lot of people will first, they come to the channel because they'll say, oh, it's analog versus digital. That's like the big thing. And that's the clickbait and the big fancy thumbnail and all of that. But really, it's more than just me okay, here's one, here's the other. Here's what I think, see you later. I try to do a lot of ear training exercises in that to teach you what to listen for, or over YouTube, sometimes it's hard to tell. So I describe in the room, what am I really hearing? What's the difference between sound-wise between an 1176 hardware compressor versus the universal audio plugin? How close are they really? In some cases, they're pretty close. In other cases, they're really different. And I try to describe in very detail what I'm really hearing, and also to help people with ear training. So when you're listening to these things, what are you listening for? And where does it make sense? Or if you were in the market for hardware, because I get this question a lot, where should I go first? I want a piece of hardware. It sounds really cool. I'm all in the box. What do I buy first? So a lot of those conversations come up about, well, maybe you should start on the master bus. Get yourself a good master bus compressor or color box or something like that that can affect the overall mix. Start on the master bus and work your way back, over time as your budget allows. But
that's where you refer to as top-down mixing.
Exactly. Because that, unless you have unlimited amount of money and deep pockets, and if you do, then hey, go to town. But if you're looking for where am I going to get the most bang for the buck, especially if I'm new to working hybrid, I always say master bus. Whether it's something like the SSL Fusion, which I have, which is a great box, or something like that, or a good master bus compressor EQ combo, something where you can run your whole mix through it and you can instantly hear what changes in the audio. And then if you like that kind of thing, and if you like what that hardware is doing to your overall mix, and if you want to continue to build it out, then you kind of build it out. Then I go back to the buses and say, okay, now we're going to go from the master bus to the buses. Get yourself a drum bus compressor maybe. Or, and then we work back to the individual channels over time. But the two biggest questions I get are, does it sound better than did plugins? And how much different does it sound? Is it worth the additional cost? That's huge. And then the physical workflow compared to what are the two differences. And because I'm fortunate now that I'm talking to you on my in the box rig where I work with plugins and do all my tutorials all day. And then right behind me is a whole nother system. So I can just wheel my chair between the two and compare them side by side. So I know what the differences really are.
So you have different monitors and everything. Different sweet spot, the whole deal.
Yeah, that was important to me. My first thought was, how do I integrate everything over into the SSL? And then I said, you know what, that's a bad idea, because you know how it is, the more complexity and all the different workflows. Yeah. I said, you know what, why should I do that? Just have two separate rigs, because I already had the in the box rig. There was nothing else to buy there. Yeah. So I just said, let me buy a whole new setup. And then this way I can just work seamlessly between the two workflows and I don't have to disconnect and reconnect anything. And it works really well.
Yeah. Well, very cool. Well, describe the Origin console just a little bit. I believe it is analog, no recall, right? And not even automation, right? So the automation is intended to happen from the Pro Tools rig, for example, or from your DAW.
Right. So yeah, so it's a 32 long, 32 short fader. So it's 64 IO console. It's an inline console and it's designed on the old E and G series consoles from the 80s and the 90s, minus the automation, which I think came in the G Plus back then.
But you do have dynamics on each channel?
You do not. So you have 32 preamps, 32 EQs, 64 faders. Yeah, no dynamics in it. No automation. No recall software. And again, this came up a lot in the beginning of the channel. People said, oh my God, and again, the console at the time was $50K. So at the time, and even still today, with the exception of maybe one of the manufacturers, there is no 64 channel, 64 fader, 32, 64 IO console for less than 100 grand. Mm-hmm. There just isn't. Now, I think Trident now makes one and someone else, but no one under the $100,000 mark has flying faders, automation, recall, and dynamics on every channel.
Right.
No manufacturer. It doesn't exist for obvious reasons, the cost, right? So the way they were able to make this console a little bit more affordable, and this is the first console that SSL put out that was in this price bracket, was to take the dynamics off every channel, take the automation software out, and take the recall software piece out of it as well. Shrink down the frame because you don't have dynamics in it anymore. And that's how they were able to do it at the 50K mark.
What about busing? Does it do routing and busing? And
it does. Like it has 8 stereo buses. It has the G series bus compressor in it, a full talkback section, routing matrix, the whole thing. So it's it has most of the features that the old aircraft carriers used to have, except for the things that we just mentioned.
Yeah. So really, we're thinking about the console in terms of sonics, in terms of sort of a tonality and a smoothness to the sound potentially, and harmonic distortion, things like that are pleasant to the ear.
Right.
We're thinking about the benefit and the power of analog EQs for sculpting and carving things. And then also the routing gives us that ability to create our own parallel processing channels and things like that in real time, right?
You can route almost endless possibilities in that console. You can do really almost anything you want from a routing perspective. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's very cool. And actually, I now have the Big 6 in my studio.
Right.
So I've been learning that and exploring it, and I need to. One of the challenges with getting gear in the studio that I'm sure you're familiar with is when you get the gear, you don't actually have the gear until you've wired it up to the patch bay.
That's right.
We always forget about that little detail.
Yes.
So remember that, Rockstars. If you want to get a mixer or a new piece of gear or anything, you need to include in your thinking, okay, how am I going to actually get this to the patch bay so I can patch it in on sessions and use it? I guess unless you have a small studio and then maybe you're just a couple of mic cables in and out,
Right. But a patch bay is really helpful.
Yeah, sometimes I wish I had one of those studios where you just go behind the gear and just plug the mic pretty directly into whatever you need.
Right. Yeah, I wish, yeah.
Okay, so then the other feature of the Origin that I remember learning about, Fady was down showing it off at Ocean Way Studios here in Nashville.
Yep.
Is that there's this center section. And then also Tom Lord-Alge was talking about it as well.
Yep.
But the center section allows you to load up things like the UF8 or rack gear like the Fusion and things like that. And you can kind of customize it. So you can actually have all the analog faders, but you can also have the digital control right in the center to control the plugins and interact with your DAW as well, which was pretty hip.
Yeah, right. So the center section is basically a 19-inch rack. So the center section, the talkback section, and the routing matrix is in a module or piece that could be moved up to the front of the console or back closer to you. And you end up having what I think is equivalent to nine open spaces. You could put 500 racks in there with modules. If you wanted to put, say, a mastering hardware chain in there, you can put the UF8 in there, and it fits beautifully in there. If you want to use your DAW faders, or any combination of stuff, you can put the Fusion in there if you want. So yeah, that's something that the old vintage consoles did not have. So it is a pretty cool thing. So you can put put a DAW controller in there, and you kind of have the best of both worlds right from the sweet spot, which is kind of nice.
Now, have you found that you've ended up creating kind of your own version of recall? Like, do you use iPhone photos of things combined with the Pro Tools session to do a recall on something? Or do you find that what are some of the workflows that you've found you settled right into? Like, did you try and recall your EQ settings and your faders, or did you just decide, you know what, I'm going to leave my faders at 0 and do all the movement through the DAW? Or did you also find that you're going to keep the same routing and pathways for things so that your EQs even stay the same for certain drum sounds and stuff like that?
Tried all of that and got rid of all of that, and realized that when I started to try to leave things set up, that it was more work from session to session. So what I do is I actually zero everything out. And I know from an efficiency standpoint, people go, that is the craziest thing. But for me, no two projects are the same. And I tried to do exactly what you just said. We tried for months to say, where can we turn the least amount of pots and move the least amount of faders?
Right.
And what we found was when we went from one session to the other, because of all the variables were different, it took so long to set up the sessions that it got confusing. So I just strip everything down to zero and I just start a project from absolute scratch. Now, what that means is, but as you know, when you work on a console and you get used to it, it's way faster to mix on a console than it is in the box. So it doesn't take me I wasn't really saving anything by trying to keep things pseudo templated. It didn't really work. For me personally, I even go as far as to unpatch the gear from the patch bay, even though I'll always, not always, but I would used to say, this is my favorite drum bus compressor, and I'm always going to route the drums down to bus number 1 in the center section. So I'm going to leave that compressor patched in. And you could do that. And I did that for a while. But what I found was by doing that, it kind of stifled my creativity and I got lazy. And I said, well, what if I wanted to try a different flavor on that drum bus? But I already got it patched in. So we'll just use that. So so part of this workflow and part of the things that you sacrifice from working all in the box is that, yes, it's physical. So you either like that or you don't. And I like going over there and saying, okay, let's patch this in. Let's try this a little different. And starting from scratch allows me to do that. It doesn't allow me to get too locked into one thing because every project is different. And so I start from zero. The way I do the recall is really simple. At the end of the session, I take iPhone photos because they're high res. I can blow them up on a big screen and see every single setting. I take photos of the gear. All those digital photos stay in a packet with the session, just like you would. And if I have to recall something, I can recall that board and all the gear in probably 45 minutes, which again, people say, well, that's insane. But I also did a video not too long ago. Again, people got all excited. I say, I don't do recalls. And, and the truth of the matter is, and again, I don't mix full time, but I mix lots of client work. I could count on one hand, even when I was in the box, that I ever had someone come back to me after we signed off the project, after I gave him all the files, after we went through the back and forth and we tweaked everything to the end of its life. Had I ever had an artist come back to me a month later and go, we need to turn down the hi-hat about 2 dB. Because they
send you a text from their seat at the Grammys.
Right.
Hey, I think if it's not too late, could we turn down the hi-hat?
Here's the thing. If I was working from an artist that's sitting at the Grammys, maybe I'm not using an Origin. Maybe I'm using a Duality that has all that stuff in there. That's a $200,000 console. Nice. Okay. So for the clients that I'm working with, it's like, look, part of the beauty of analog and not having all those features is that we have a moment in time. We have a snapshot in time. We're performing the mix just like you were performing the record when you were playing it. And you know what? We're going to go back and forth until you're happy, and we're going to make a commitment and we're going to move on. It doesn't mean that I can't recall it. I can, but to be totally honest, I charge for that. So I say, look, if you want me to spend 2 hours bringing up the console, making all your changes and doing all that, it's a 2-hour charge. Is turning down that hi-hat a half a dB going to change the fundamentals of the record? Is turning down that hi-hat a half a dB? Now, again, this is after we signed off the mix, after 5 revisions, and you've had it for a month. We're not talking about, I sent you the first mix and you want me to change it. I mean, after the project has been signed off.
Yeah.
Is the difference between someone buying your music and not buying your music have anything to do with the half a dB on the hi-hat? Probably not. And if it really does, sure, we can go back and we can fix it, or we can change it, or we can do whatever you want. But this is a business and time is money. And so what I try to do when I'm mixing for people too, and I'm sure you've run into this, is I do an enormous amount of preparation before a project even starts, talking to clients, lots of calls like this, getting a really good understanding about what the client's looking for, what they want. So when we're going through this process, and the lines of communication are always fluid and always open, that there's no surprises. So when we get to the end and they say, and I don't rush my client, look, you need 3 days to listen to the mix? Fine. No problem. I'll leave it on the console. I got other stuff I can do.
Nice.
So this way you can be sure, you can sit with it. You can listen to it in 400 different places if that's what you want to do. But once we pull it from the desk, it's done. If you want to go back, I can go back. And I use that process I described, pictures and stuff, and I can bring it back up. But honestly, I don't get a lot of requests to do recalls. I just don't. And I'm not mixing in Nashville where I'm mixing, hundreds of records a year. I'm in a different kind of environment. And so I know producers and engineers that are working on 250 records a year, and they have the client requirements that if, I always use this joke, if Taylor Swift wants her stuff recalled, well, then by God, Taylor Swift gets her stuff recalled. She should. She's the artist. But then I would have a different set of tools to be able to do that if I had that kind of demand. But I really, truly don't. So recall is not something that's a real big problem. The thing that I wish this had that it doesn't have, which I have workarounds for, is that it doesn't have the automation piece in it.
Right, yeah.
So the automation piece is a little bit more manual here, but it works, and I work around it, you know?
Yeah. I am totally blown away with Isotope Ozone, Rockstars. I've been mastering a lot of my records recently, and Ozone makes it so easy for me to get a fantastic sound. The mastering assistant will help you get started by measuring your track and suggesting all the settings you need to get a professionally targeted result based on the genre and EQ curve of your choice. You can even reference a specific song if you want, using simple yet sophisticated modules like clarity, impact, low-end focus, stabilizer, imager, exciter, and spectral shaping, along with powerful dynamic EQ, compression, and limiting. You simply adjust the settings to your own taste, and it sounds incredible. And don't get me started on Master Rebalance, which literally lets you reach into the mix and manipulate the vocals, bass, and drums at the mastering stage. My bandmates are pretty demanding of my mixes, but now when I send off the masters for approval, I get comments back like, "Holy shit, pristine, damn good mastering, crystal clear, dude, you're a wizard. Finally, I love my singing, and the drums and bass sound huge." Check out the newest Ozone, RX, and all the other great plugins at isotope.com and use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off. OWC is your one-stop shop for flexible drive storage and connectivity solutions for your studio. The Mini Stack STX for your Mac Mini adds 2 additional drives over a universal SATA HDD SSD bay and an NVMe M.2 PCIe SSD, plus 3 additional Thunderbolt USB ports. The OWC Thunder Bay 4 chassis, built like a tank, gives you 4 hot-swappable 2.5-inch RAID configurable drive bays, plus an extra Thunderbolt 3 jack for daisy chaining up to 5 devices. Or check out the OWC Gemini Thunderbolt 3 dock with 2 RAID configurable drives and 7 ports of connectivity, including a front-side SD card reader, 1 gig Ethernet, 2 USB 3.2 ports, a dedicated display port, and an additional backward-compatible Thunderbolt port. Get your studio connected with the Mini Stack STX, Thunder Bay 4, and Gemini Thunderbolt 3 dock at macsales.com/rockstars. Use the custom link in our show notes because it's a great way for you to help support this podcast. So thanks, Rockstars. Howdy, Rockstars. We're back now for the second half of this show, aka the Jam Session. My guest today is David Vignola, joining us from Home Recording Made Easy, Mixing Made Easy, and Mixing Music Analog. Did I get all 3 right?
You got him. You got him right. Yes, you got him.
I didn't even read him. It was straight out of my brain. Look at
awesome.
that.
Great.
Are you ready to jam, dude?
Sure. Yeah, let's roll.
All right, let's keep rocking. So the hybrid thing is super cool. But let's pivot now back to mixing in the box.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the stuff that you might want to teach the Rockstars about, setting up a mix template, for example. Is that a fair question? Is that too deep a topic, or can we kind of skim over it a bit and just give some good tips on how to think about setting up a great mix template for mixing a rock band with vocals and stuff?
Mix templates are great. And especially if you're using, because I get a lot of questions. People say, well, how do you replicate all that analog stuff in the box? That's what a lot of people want to know. And so I feel like I specialize, for lack of a better word, in that, where I do teach stuff where you just use your stock Pro Tools stuff. I have a lot of courses on stock plugin stuff. But what if you wanted to replicate this analog sounds with all the great plugins that are available, but you don't want to go out and buy all the analog stuff? Makes a lot of sense, right? So I said, I have a course called Mixing with Analog Style Plugins Made Easy, which a lot of people go out and, we have all these great companies, right? Plugin Alliance and Slate Digital and Universal Audio and FabFilter, and they all make these great channel strips and the 1176s and the LA2As. But what I found was a real need was nobody really teaches you how to use those plugins effectively. They're not the same as using a stock plugin. They're designed in a way to be used with the way analog gear is kind of used, the gain staging, the whole thing. And so when we talk about mix templates, if you want to set up like an analog studio virtually, that's how I do it in that course. I think that course is 20 hours long. And we spend an enormous amount of time comparing channel strips and tape machines and saturators and what do all these things do. But setting up a mix template is really, really great. So if you want to try to replicate what I do analog in the box, you can set up a template where we start with, pick a channel strip, an Eve, SSL, API, whatever your favorite flavor is. Put that on all your tracks as the first insert on all of your tracks. Drums, bass, guitars, all of it. So just like on a desk. So the first thing that everything is hitting is the preamp of that plugin. So if you have that in your template, when you pull it up, you can have a template with your Neve channel strip, a template with your SSL, a template with your API, or whatever you're going to use. So you can have different flavors. Then on a template, I will typically have a busing system of some kind, right? So maybe I'll have 8 empty buses for drums, guitars, vocals, synths, whatever. And on those buses, I'll use stuff like the Slate Digital Virtual Console collection, or maybe a tape machine as my first 2 inserts and leave that as part of my mixing template.
Let me interject this question just for the rock stars who are listening to this and maybe don't even know what a bus is yet. I think many of us do, but some of us it might still be a new word. And essentially the way to think about that is instead of each track going directly to the stereo output of your mix, you're going to sort of an intermediate output that then goes to the stereo output of your mix.
Correct. Right. So you can take all your drums, bring them to one fader, control the whole drum kit level with one fader. And then from there, it goes out to your stereo output on your DAW.
Yeah.
So having a busing system is valuable. And again, if you're trying to mimic the analog kind of vibe and flavor, you can do that as well. I also will always suggest, have a set of effects channels or aux channels, they call them in Pro Tools, where you have some reverbs and delays maybe set up, your favorite reverb plugin, your favorite delays plugins. So you have all the basic tools that you're going to start with. And then every project will be different and you'll add things as you go. But one of the challenges about mixing in the box is that, as we said a little earlier, if you could take away some of the amount of times you have to go to your plugin browser and drag stuff in the middle of a session, and you can have the basic foundation already set up with your basic core plugins. Now, when the music starts coming through, you can start more into the mixing part of it, and you're not constantly opening, closing, and moving plugins from your browser into your session. So I do that a lot when I was mixing in the box with analog plugins. That's how I would do it. I would set it up like a little studio. I would think about the signal flow of how the signal flow would work in a real studio. It bands in the live room, comes into the console, goes through the bus section or the master section of the console, goes out to back in the day, to a tape machine. Yeah. Now it's Pro Tools, but to a tape machine. And you can do all of that in the box. And you can get, something that sounds relatively close to an analog sound.
Yeah, I found that I would sort of think about it similarly as well. How would I have actually done it with the console? So,
right.
The mic pre's from the floor where the band is playing come in, and then they hit the tape machine. Maybe they went through EQ and compression. Then that comes and hits the console. Then it's hitting the EQ and the insert is there. Maybe you pass through a compressor on the way to the console, or maybe you insert it after EQ. And then all of that goes and, might typically go through a mix compressor and then get printed to a tape machine.
Right.
And the fun thing about plugins is you can start breaking all those rules. You can let's move the tape before the compressor. Let's move it after the compressor. Let's see what it sounds like.
Right. You can come up with some really cool stuff, but here's a little insider pro tip to that when you're using those kind of plugins that people tend to miss. You just said it. You want to kind of visualize, how does the signal flow work in an analog room? But you also got to remember too, unless you're Jack Joseph Puig or a couple of these guys where they have, a whole room full of racks and racks and racks of compressors and EQs and outboard gear, they have limitations. Most analog studios will have, let's say, a pair of 76s, maybe a pair of LA2As, maybe a couple of Pultecs. In other words, limit your choices. Think of the outboard gear like you would in a studio. The great thing about digital is I could put a Pultec EQ on every single track. But in an analog room, unless you have 15 Pultecs, and most studios don't, at least not the studios I used to work in, you don't want to do that. Plus, and they can say, well, but in digital, you can do that. So why wouldn't you do that? Here's why you wouldn't do that. Because the reason why you use a Pultec EQ is because it has this very specific sound to it, right? Anything you run through a Pultec is going to give it that sound. Lead vocal, for example, it's going to sound different than the EQ on your channel strip or the EQ on my Origin. So it gives that particular element that you put that Pultec on a little bit of flavor, a little bit of pizzazz, a little bit of something unique and different that's not on the rest of the session. As soon as you drop 40 Pultecs across your Pro Tools session, all that uniqueness went away. So some of the secret and some of the reason why those old analog records sound the way they do is because the engineer had limitations and he had to make decisions. So if I only have one Pultec, where am I going to put it? And you start a different mindset, and this will keep you from, and we've all been there, where you open up your plugin browser and there's 2,000 plugins in it, and you go, I have an acoustic guitar track here. Wait a minute. Let me open up the plugin browser and let's spend 45 minutes trying to figure out which EQ and compressor I want to use on it.
There's a name for when you're supposed to do that.
What is it called?
It's called Saturday.
Yeah. Right?
It's called your day off.
And this is why working analog is in a lot of ways is faster. And I noticed it when I started doing it here, because I look at the rack and I go, I have quite a bit of gear. I go, you know what? I got an acoustic guitar. We got 6 compressors available to me. Which one? And in 30 seconds, I can make a decision, and then I can quickly swap one out if I want to hear a different sound. Where you can get bogged down in the box. So if you want to speed up the workflow and you don't want to overmix something, because I get that question a lot, how do you know when to stop? Well, part of knowing when to stop is limitations. If you can put some limitations on yourself in the box. So using all of that in a template makes sense. So I always say, in my course, I tell people, write it down on a piece of paper. Let's give ourselves a couple of racks of outboard gear. Let's give ourselves 2 1176 plugins. Let's give ourselves a couple of LA2As. Yeah, let's give ourselves a Fairchild. Maybe we were lucky enough to have a Fairchild. Most studios don't, but we're lucky enough to have one.
A Fairchild.
Yeah, a couple of Pultecs, and then you have a couple of saturation plugins or something. Let's give ourselves about 12.
What about the red desk that the Beatles use? Can we give ourselves one of those too?
If you got the Waves plugin, you can. Let's give ourselves, let's fill up our virtual analog studio with a list of a dozen or so pieces of gear. And as you use them in the session, cross them off the list and say, and try to, and if you build that into your template, that's going to really help speed up your workflow.
Yeah. Let me add to that. So I had this great vision when you were talking about the Pultec analogy. And, my kid is in, the High School Musical. So I've been going and seeing a little bit more theater recently. And I just realized that you just described the spotlight. The spotlight is a very powerful thing because it shines on the lead in the moment that the lead speaker or singer is happening on the stage. And if you put a spotlight on everybody at the same time, that's called when they turn the house lights on and the entire audience and the whole the whole theater goes bright white.
Right.
And it doesn't have the same effect at all.
Right. Nobody stands out. And so if you think about your plugins like that, I think you'll learn to mix faster. You'll learn to mix more consistently. Your mixes will become more cohesive sounding, and you'll start to develop your own style and your own sound, which I feel is important.
Okay, cool. So let me see. What was I going to ask you about next there? There was a video you did where you started talking about, you kind of demonstrated how to use the slate analog tape machine across the tracks and across the 2-bus. Talk a little bit about that. There are at least a few considerations you might want to make just within the plugin itself when you're setting up sort of an analog tape. And maybe it's fair to just include in that discussion a little bit of what really happens on analog tape. What were some of the choices and decisions that needed to be made?
Right. So on that particular plugin, it's a multi faceted plugin in that they have a multi-track version of it, like I think the old Studers, maybe the 16-track version, and then they have the 2-track version of it. So the thinking is in some studios, I think you alluded to it a little bit earlier, where it comes off the live floor and it may go through a multi-track tape machine before it hits the console. So that's one way to think about it. So if you wanted to put that as your first insert on that particular plugin on the multi-track setting. Now, there's on all tape machine plugins, and this one is no different, there's different tape formulas you can choose from, and those are all going to give a little bit of a different sound. There's the inches per second. Is it 30 inches per second or 15? And that's going to give it a little bit different sound. But more importantly, what the tape machine does, and what all those kinds of plugins do, by the way, and the way I think about them, is they're all really, on some level, a compressor. A tape machine is a compressor, even though it's not called a compressor, right? It's going to it's going to compress the low end. It's going to, depending on the plugin and the tape formula, it's going to smooth out the top end a little bit, take some of that maybe brittleness out of it.
A little bit of an EQ curve built in. EQ curve.
And some of the settings that you can tweak on these plugins and tape machines will give the EQ curve a little bit of a different feel. And it kind of, by putting that across all the channels, everything that's coming through it that's hitting that is kind of molding and gluing and kind of giving you a nice foundation from which to start from, which is important. Now, again, in digital, you can set those, you could put, one set of tape machines on your drums, and then a whole nother different set of tape machines on your guitars, and you can have all the settings be different. That's the cool thing about digital. But what I tell people is I wouldn't recommend that. If we're going to go 15 inches per second on a tape machine, everything is 15 inches per second. And if we're going to use the GP9 tape formula, everything is going to get the GP9 tape formula, because that's how it would have been. You'd have one multi-track tape machine and you pick the tape and you pick the speed, and that's what we recorded through. And so you don't have to do it that way, and you could come up with some real interesting sounds and things by messing around with it, and that's totally valid as well. But I'm more of the old school, more traditional approach to it, more simplified, I think, at least in my mind it is.
Yeah, so, that's cool. And then I was also reminded when you were talking about the compressors and choosing which one you want to use for something, you don't want to go through the plugin, the 1,000 plugin folder when you're sitting down to mix. You do want to do that at some point. You do want to experiment. It's sort of like learning the presets on a synth, which I've been trying to do, and I'm still just like pulling my hair out. I'm like, how does anybody ever know where the sound is that they want on these synths? There's so many. What do songwriters, music producers, DJs, EDM, TV, and film composers all have in common? They all need incredibly cool sounds that instantly transport the music to the style that they want. This is why Native Instruments is your ultimate toolkit with a massive library of sounds. Whether you want to create hip-hop, indie pop, classic rock, meditation music, pumping dance floor beats, or full orchestral arrangements, Native Instruments Complete Bundle offers you everything you need, from drums, loops, and beats to wild synths, ultra-realistic strings, and vintage electric bass, guitars, and keys. The list goes on and on. I personally love recording real bands in my studio and adding cool drum samples, synths, and futuristic keys from Battery, Contact, Massive X, Guitar Rig, and Hybrid keys, for example. Plus, it's super fun to create a string section for a rock band. Come on, go get Complete Start for free today with a bundle of 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of samples over at nativeinstruments.com and use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off. Some restrictions apply. Atom Audio introduces the all-new A-Series line of monitors, featuring the XART accelerated ribbon tweeter design, built-in DSP-based room correction, and speaker voicings to allow you to customize your Atom Audio monitors to your control room. The A series will rock in any studio. Small studio spaces or immersive multi-speaker configurations are perfect for the A4V or the new A7V, the next generation of the incredibly popular A7X. Mid-size rooms and narrow spaces will love the low profile of the A44H, expanding on the A7V sound, or the A77H, a true three-way midfield monitor delivering rich, spacious sound. And bigger studios will love the A8H, a three-way speaker and the pinnacle of the A series that delivers extremely accurate sound required for critical listening environments. Get the Atom audio monitors and subwoofers that are right for your studio with an extended 5-year warranty at atomaudio.com. As far as the plugins go, one of the things that I did, so I made a video that was a 7 mic shootout for Jay-Z microphones. And I was like, I got 7 of their microphones. I'm going to try them on all these different instruments. And it was a cool experiment to go through. And I know you've done stuff like this too. You've done different microphones and different pieces of gear. But what I found was before a session, I was like, hey, which one do I want to use on the acoustic guitar? And I was like, oh, I'm just going to go look at my own video and watch it,
Right.
And it was really something to go back there and do it like that. And it occurs to me that this could be a really great exercise for all of us in our studios, is to actually, like creatively export these different sounds outside of the moment. So in other words, what if we went in and we took an acoustic guitar track and we tried out 5 different plugins that we've got for compression and stuff like that on a separate, sit down, and we actually export those as little clips of audio.
Right.
And then we don't even open a session. We just go later and we're like, I'm going to do acoustic today, or I'm going to do drums. Which one do I feel like using? And you just listen to each of those clips and you're like, oh, I really like the sound of that one today. That might be kind of a fun way to do it too, because sometimes I find even when you're comparing sounds with plugins in the moment, it can be hard to decide which one you actually like.
Right, because I think because you're talking about you have the technical side of mixing and then you have the creative side of mixing or recording, right? And it is really for me anyway, it's really 2 parts of the brain, the way it works and the way you think about things. So I always encourage everyone, whether you're in plugins, whether you're with hardware, to have separate sessions when you're not working on a project, you're writing a song or working with a client or whatever, where you can just experiment. So you understand what your tools do, like you said. So you can say, oh, geez, I didn't realize that on acoustic guitar, an 1176 blue stripe has a little bit more of a brighter top end than, let's say, the 1176, the black plate in the front. Which is more warm. And now you know that, because when I think of compressors in particular, especially with hardware, I don't think about them as compressors. I think about them as EQs.
Yeah, like tone makers.
Right. I was just about to say, people in the industry will call it tone boxes. The reason why they call it a tone box is because they all compress. They all control dynamic range. And there are different types of compression for people that are a little bit more advanced. But in the end of the day, every one of those things do one thing: they compress. How they tonally shape the sound is how I think of it. So when I'm choosing a compressor, whether it's a plugin or whether it's a piece of hardware, the first thing I'm saying to myself is, what do I want it to do tonally? Because I could pick anything to compress it. I can pick a stock plugin to compress it. And when you start to do that experimentation you were talking about, you start to learn, well, how do they sound different? And why is there, 5 different versions of an 1176 that just look different? Well, they look different because they sound completely different.
Yeah.
But unless you've done your experiment, like you were saying, you wouldn't know that.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know that.
And a cool thought about doing these as little audio clips that we can export and listen out of the context of a song, out of the context of a project, is we might find that I know for me, when I go to the car and I listen to stuff back in the car, it gives me this new like, oh, that's what it sounds like moment,
right. Right.
Because that's where I actually listen to music. And so it can be a really cool way to discover what shit really sounds like, Yeah. And I like experimenting in my studio. I like breaking all the rules, and I'll set up different recording stations at different times. Like right now, upstairs where the instruments are, I sort of have a separate writing space for myself. And I just busted out an old Mackie mixer and everything goes to that. And then the output of that is going into some different things. And it's just fun. It's a fun experiment because then you're like, hey, that sounds, you might think, oh, that sounds really cool. Or you might decide, oh, you know what? That really did sound like shit. And I'm glad I don't use it anymore.
Sometimes you'll learn what not to do, but that is equally as valid and as important. And they say, you hear a lot of times people say, well, there's no rules. Well, there's guidelines and there are things that we do as engineers that are pretty standard that you want to follow. But once you understand those rules, you know where it makes sense to break them. And you could come up with some really cool and unique stuff by accident, just by trying things. And that again, all falls under the umbrella of developing your own style as an engineer. And you just have to develop your own sounds, much like a guitar player.
Own rules.
Your own rules, right? When Eric Clapton plays guitar, you don't need to know it's him. You know after the first 2 notes, he has a sound and a style that's unique to him. Well, engineers are the same way. I mean, I'm a big Bob Clearmountain and Chris Lord-Alge fan, right? Their mixes they're very unique in the way they sound. Chris Lord-Alge has a very specific way that he mixes, and he has his style and a sound. Now, which is totally different than, let's say, than someone like maybe an Andrew Sheps. Equally as great of an engineer, but his mixes sound different.
Or Chad Blake, he's got a very distinct different thing.
Different tools. The way they use the tools are different. They make their own set of rules, and they have their own process and style. And that has come from years of experimentation, finding the tools that you like. It's all subjective in the end. You may like something that I may not, and vice versa. And none of it's wrong. It's just what you like. And you start to develop your own style. And I think that's important. That's really, really important. And that's when, if you're doing this, trying to do this for money or a side hustle or a full-time business, people come to you because of you and your working relationship and personality and all that soft skill stuff. But they're also coming to you because they like your productions and the sound that you deliver them, whether it's recording, mixing, mastering, or whatever, right? There's hundreds and hundreds, I mean, especially where you are, hundreds and hundreds of great mixing guys. Why does one artist go to one over the other? Personality, personal connection, for sure.
I think a lot of times it's personality and personal connections, because I think depending on what kind of clients you're working with, if you're recording other people, each artist can only know so many options.
Right. So it's definitely that personal connection, past working relationships, referrals, and all of that stuff equally is important. But also, too, they're going to that person, they like the final product that's being given back to them.
Yeah. Yeah. If it sounded terrible, they wouldn't come back.
We could go out for coffee. We'd be good friends, but you're not mixing my record. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, I think I'm a big believer, because I'm a musician, that, I believe, and I try to develop and hone my own style. So when you come to me, it's like, look, you're getting something that's unique to me. My tools are unique, and the way I work with them are unique. And I think everybody should do that, whether you're working in the box or out of the box or both.
All right. So let's ask a pretty basic question. What is compression? So if we were to, we talked about, what compression ultimately means, but what are some things about compression that the Rockstars should know about, if it's sort of a new concept to people? And also, I want to interject that it's what you described, the ability to listen for those tones. It's one of the things that blows me away about Logic as a tool for a DAW, is they were so smart. The stock compressor, you put it on and you can just flip through all the different styles of compressors and instantly pick a totally different thing.
Right. Brilliant.
Very, very cool.
Why hasn't everybody done that?
Why aren't they all like that?
That's exactly right. Right. And I find that for beginners, especially, out of all the things that we talk about, all the things you need to learn, especially when it comes to mixing, the most difficult thing for a beginner or even an intermediate person is compression. And the reason why it's the most difficult, I found, is because without the ear training, when your ears are not tuned into it, it's the hardest thing to understand what you're listening for.
Yeah.
And here's the number one thing. There are two things in it from a beginner that I hear when I hear mixes, and I hear lots of them: the overuse of compression and the overuse of reverb. When we talk about compression, it's because it's over-compressed. And the reason why it's over-compressed is because they over-compress it so much, because that's when it becomes audible. And when the ear isn't trained yet to know how to hear compression and what exactly are we listening for, you overdo it so you can hear it. And they go, oh, that's what it sounds like. And you do that across 50 tracks in a session. And the next thing you know, you've squashed the daylights out of the entire track.
Yeah.
So compression in its basic form, as I teach it, it's like, look, it does one thing. It controls dynamic range. It takes the loudest parts of the audio and the quietest parts of the audio, and it shrinks them together to make the performance more even. That's it in basic forms. That's what it does. Now, every compressor is going to do that a little differently, and every compressor is going to have more or less controls on it to achieve that. But if you think about it as just taking dynamic range and shrinking it down, take something like a snare drum hit, for example. If the snare drum is hit 4 times in a row by a drummer in a performance, 2 of those hits, if you look at it on your Pro Tools screen, are going to maybe spike up, are going to be louder. He hit the drum harder than he did on the other 2. He didn't play it completely consistent. Okay, so you have 2 big peaks out of 4. The compressor is going to take those peaks and it's going to shrink them down to where they're more in line with the 2 hits that weren't hit as hard. Same thing if he maybe didn't he maybe had more of a rim shot than a snare hit, and maybe have 2 parts of those hits that are too quiet. Well, it's going to bring up the lower volumes as well, and it's going to make the performance sound a little more even. So, but learning how to hear compression and how to focus, especially when you're listening through a mix and you're listening through an entire mix and trying to hear the compression on an acoustic guitar inside of a mix is very difficult for someone who doesn't know what to listen for. So I've created courses around all this stuff on how you actually do the ear training to get your ear to hear that compression. And when you first hear it, I tell everybody, when your ear finally when your brain ear connects with that thing, you have what I call an aha moment. And you go, now I know what I'm supposed to listen for. So as I turn the attack control, I could hear as it's starting to chop the transient off. And once you can hear that, and then you put that Logic plugin on that you talked about, and you switch between the 3, and you hear how it sounds like someone put an EQ on all 3 of those differently, you just got like the keys to the kingdom of how to use a compressor in a completely different way. And it'll change your life when you're learning how to mix.
Yeah. Do you remember some of the first moments you had your aha compression?
Yeah, I do. I remember it. Well, yeah, it was way back when it was, again, just like with everyone, it was the hardest thing for me to learn. Like I would be working with someone and they would go, okay, let's turn it on, turn it off. And I'm like, I don't hear any difference. And I'm like, I can't, this is not the profession for me. I don't have the ears. You hear about the golden ears and all those fancy words we throw around. Like some of these guys have magic ears. Well, they really don't have magic ears. They just have very well trained ears, and they've been able to connect the ear to the brain, and they can hear these little subtle details. And that only just comes with time. You can, this is a taught skill that you can learn if you're willing to put the time in. But I remember the first time we were doing it in a studio, and it was with hardware. We were doing it with I think it was an 1176 type compressor, and he was doing it with me on a snare drum. That's how I teach it too. It was really obvious on a snare drum, and he was trying to really pinpoint what we're listening for. Is we're not listening for the sound of the tone of the snare or the sustain. We're listening for the first time that stick hits the head, that very first transient, that first peak. And he would put it up on the screen and we're looking at it, and then he would, really squash it. And he goes, you hear how the way the stick, you can almost visualize the drumstick hitting the drum head. And now when I over compress it, it sounds like it's smushed, like it's muffled. And in something in that explanation, I went, oh, now I hear what it is. So he would overdo it, and then he would back it off a little at a time to where it's become more and more subtle. But once my ear was tuned into that thing, and we were doing it all in solo, we weren't doing it in a mix. We were doing everything in solo, so I could really hear it. And that's when I went, oh, now I get it. And then he started to say, well, now here's the difference between the 1176 and here's an LA2A on that same snare. We're compressing it. Look at the meters, about 4 or 5 dB. But what sounds different? And it was different. It sounded different. It's a whole different type of compression technology. The LA2A did not sound like the 1176. Even though we were compressing about 5 dB, it didn't sound the same. And he goes, well, which one do you like better? I said, well, I like the 1176. He goes, yeah, and that's typically what a lot of engineers will use that. It's a FET style compressor. And you can get all to the technical stuff about why on a snare, maybe that style of compressor might be more suitable than maybe an LA2A because it's a different type of compression. But the whole point of that lesson was How do you get your ears tuned in to that thing first? And then now that you got it tuned in, how do you think about it as an EQ? And that's what he said to me. He goes, listen to it like an EQ. Don't listen to it like a compressor. This one sounds brighter than this one. Well, why is that? We're not putting an EQ on it. And then you can get into all the technical mumbo jumbo about why it sounds brighter. But that doesn't matter. You don't need to know why. You just need to know that it does or it doesn't. And then you can make decisions based on that. So that was the first time that I went, oh, when I first heard it, I got it. Because compression for me was like with a lot of people. I didn't understand it. It was like this black voodoo that was out there that only the big name engineers knew how to do, and with the big consoles. And it's like, no, it's really not that complicated, but you have to be able to tune your ear to it. It's ear training. It's no different than tuning a guitar by ear. You should use a tuner, but really
it's a good place to start.
Yeah, but really good guitar players, session players, take a tune by ear and it's spot on. It's just years of listening to that thing and knowing what it sounds like. And that's all it is.
What you discover when you play a lot of guitars, you discover that you can't actually get it in tune with just the tuner. The tuner just brings you
close.
It gets you close, and the rest of it you have to do by ear.
Or we just say it's close enough for rock and roll, which is always my excuse.
Yeah. Well, you know, you're up there in Connecticut, not too far from New York, punk rock central back in the day. So
a
lot of great music. Tuning, schmooning.
No.
Well, very cool. Yeah. So the compression stuff, I remember in school, I don't really remember thinking about compression a lot in school, but we learned it. And I remember I probably learned, I learned ratio and I learned the technical side of it all, but I didn't know what to make of it. And then when I was interning, the owner of the studio, he was mixing in the other room, and he said, "Do you know about parallel compression?" And I was like, "No, what's that?" And he showed me what happened when he took all the drums and then he bussed them over to another compressor and brought that in on another fader, and he dropped it in. And it was like, holy shit, that just sounds like, that's a completely different drum feel and sound and energy. It was It's like it put the excitement into the drums.
Right.
And that was my first aha moment with that. And then the next studio I ended up at, where I first had my chance to assist, again, those guys were doing mixes, and they were, I listened to what they did to the room mics, and I was like, whoa, I just thought of room mics as you just put some mics out in the room and, there they are. And then, here they were compressing them. And the compressor we had back then was the Alesis 3630.
Okay.
Which was kind of a great one, because it was the first home studio compressor that we got where you had access to all these controls, limiting, attack, release, all the ratios, all that stuff. And, now, of course, that stuff all comes... You've got every plugin, every stock plugin has all that
stuff, right? Yeah. So we're spoiled today for sure.
Which is just such a different world to to come up and learn this stuff. Have you found that your students, do you try and get them to learn the art of no EQ, no compression, start out with balancing first and building a mix and understanding it that way?
Yeah. So some of my courses where we're just starting off, we will just balance no EQ, no compression. And then the very first thing I teach when we're teaching about this stuff is EQ, because EQ is the most important tool you got. So that leads
into my next question, which is, how should we use EQ? ?
Yeah. So because that is, to me, where you're carving out the space, where all the EQ and panning, all the space, all the clarity. Before we start talking about which tape machine are we going to use, let's talk about balance and EQ first.
Yeah.
So, part of my mixing membership website, where we do monthly mixes together, every month I have a different challenge. And there are several months throughout the year where you only get to use one EQ. It could be any EQ, but only one. And maybe sometimes I'll say you can use one compressor, put it on one of the tracks, the master bus, a vocal, wherever you want. And
can we use the right EQ?
Well, we can use anything you want. Yeah, the right one. And I say, but we got to get clarity. We got to get clarity without all that stuff. Because if you start a mix with balance and clarity, panning, and some light EQ, then everything you put on top of it's only going to sweeten the pie, as opposed to trying to do it the other way around.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm really big at, we got to start with as I teach this stuff from the ground up, it's about the basic foundational stuff. We don't get into all the fancy channel strips and tape machines and all the things we've been talking about until And I don't even tell people buy any third-party plugins. Whatever DAW you're using, and I don't care which one it is, because to me, they all sound the same. At least from a beginner's perspective, they do.
Yeah.
Use your stock plugins. Regardless of your DAW, you have plenty of stock plugins that all sound wonderful. And just start with your stock EQ and your stock compressor. And when you can get a mix that sounds clean, balanced, with clarity and some excitement consistently, then if you want something different and you want to know about, well, what is all this stuff about harmonic distortion and saturation and all these buzzwords? Well, then we can start talking about what plugins or tools do you want to use to give it a different sound. Doesn't mean it's not a better sound. It's just a different sound. And so, but if you don't understand the basic fundamentals about balance, EQ, basic levels of compression to just make the mix balance and sound right, where we could hear all the instruments and getting the vocal to sit on top of the mix and all those basic stuff, then all the other specialty things, the fancy plugins with the tape machines that you see all the reels spinning and the fancy, meters and stuff, all that's going to do is just make the mix sound worse. It's going to muddy it up and cloud it up. So I find a lot of times with people that are new to this stuff, they just, because it's a marketing thing, every plugin company will tell you that their plugin, if you just drop it on the mix, it's a Grammy. We got a Grammy.
Right.
And that's just not true, which is why I created the courses that teach you how to use the plugins, because it's not about the tool, it's how you use the tool. But this is why when I see people say there's no rules in mixing. Well, yes, there is rules. There are basic fundamentals. And then once you have those, then you get to the level where we can all go out and break those rules and make up our own rules to develop our own personal style.
Well, you know what they say, it's not your pencil, it's how you sign your name with it.
That's right. It's so true. It's so true.
That was my very mild version of an inappropriate joke there.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And that's why I tell people, I've mixed in the box for way longer than I've been mixing with all the hardware stuff. And I'm saying I can get a good mix with any set of tools. It doesn't even matter. You talk about the hardware. So, well, what gear you got? All this. You can give me any of that. It doesn't matter.
Do you ever feel like the time that you've spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take you years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Listen to this quote from one of our students, David, quote, "Absolutely the most informative and helpful block of information and mentoring on the mix process that I've ever been a part of. That was like sitting behind a mix engineer for years, watching and picking up tips along the way, but condensed into a 6 to 7 hour session," close quote. Look, I'm so confident that this will take your mixes to the next level that if you can't get a killer mix within 30 days, I'll give you a full refund, no questions asked. So if you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then go to ultimatemixingmasterclass.com and start now by checking out the free preview of the Ultimate Snare Mixing Trick. And I'll see you at the front row table of the Grammys. Cheers. Well, the funny thing is, when you've done enough recording, that's not just a claim, that's actually an experience. And that's what's so fascinating is once you've recorded in a lot of different places and a lot of different situations, and it's sort of why I was suggesting that exporting the stuff and listening to clips of audio outside of a session, because you get that experience where you just listen back unencumbered by the moment to these different recordings you've done. And you will have an aha moment where you're like, wow, that one sounds great. What did I do there? And then you're like, wait, I didn't have any of this stuff. Wasn't that the time I was just on that, I was in somebody's basement studio and we didn't have any fancy stuff or whatever. Or, you might find that the greatest one was this incredible gear that you had at one particular time, but there's so much that can happen that is just the balancing. I remember doing a record for Will Kimbrough called Home Away. And we had done, this was back when you'd do the tracking and then you'd bounce a CD of your mixes along the journey of producing a record.
Right,
so like,
right.
I just had these CDs, and they'd go in the car and I'd have the rough mixes. And we were further down into the record and we were doing overdubs and I had done all this, kind of mixing, tweaking to it. And I went into the car and sure enough, I listened to where we were at today and I listened to the rough mix that I had done after the tracking session. And the rough mix sounded way better. And I was like, what? I was like, what happened? And it was that lesson where I learned that, you got to get the very basic elements of it right. And I run into this all the time. The more it can be frustrating because sometimes that you can improve on it, but you also know that you could just as easily screw it up by losing the magic, But there's that thing where like, what happens in the moment, the tracking session, if you're working with the band where you do the rough mix and it's got the energy was created,
Right.
And that's a really important thing to be aware of, and hold on to as you figure out how to improve it in the mix. Just like take a snapshot, Rockstars, and make sure that you recognize, you hold that rough mix up in the light and you're like, okay, this might not be the final version, but there is a thing that's cool.
Absolutely.
That happened that I got to retain that all the way through the final production.
Right. And then also remember too, which I know you would agree with, that, there is no such thing as fix it in the mix. 80%, 70%, if you want to be conservative, of a great sounding mix is a great recording with great players.
Yeah.
And a great
fix it
song.
In the pre-production.
Right. Fix it pre-production.
Fix it in the songwriting.
And how many times have you heard, I just watched an interesting interview on Rick Beato's channel with Steve Lukather, who I love.
Yeah.
And he was talking about a lot of these. We're just kind of alluding to what you were just saying. How many times what you hear on the record is the first or second take? And I think he was talking about Michael Jackson, a couple of things that Steve had played on. And he was just like, first thing, we whipped it out. It was the inspiration. You listen to something. In that case, worked with Michael, bump, 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 bump. And the next thing you do, he's got the riff of Beat It. And it's in 40 minutes and it's done. It's not take 620. I know they did 192 mixes of that or whatever it was. But the moral of the story was they had a vibe and an energy. And these guys are, we're talking about world-class players that could come into a place and could put something down, and they didn't overthink it. They didn't overcook it. They didn't put too much spice in the soup. They captured a performance, a great performance. And you got to use some of that approach, I think, to mixing as well. It's like we got a really great, and I always say this too, because people say, I get this a lot from my students. They'll say, this is great, Dave. We got a lot of great multi-tracks you share with us. These are great recordings. Can you show us how to take a bunch of crappy tracks and make them sound great? And I said, absolutely not. That goes against everything that I believe in and what I teach. And there is no such thing. There are things we can fix. Yes. We're not saying we don't fix anything. We have to tune a vocal. We have to fix some timing. But I'm talking about the raw performance. The musicianship has to be there because that is 70% of the record.
Yeah.
If you don't do that, you're going to have a really difficult time. So I said, no, we're not here to teach you how to fix bad tracks. Let's teach you how to make good tracks in your home studio, because you can. You don't need to come to you don't need to go to Blackbird to record really good quality stuff,
Yeah.
Blackbird's great, and you could go there and get some really, really great stuff. But you can record on a laptop and a $200 interface, and you can get good quality recordings. You really, truly can. That sound professional with our technology today.
Absolutely. You just have to make smart decisions about stuff. And I've experienced this a lot too, where, I might record quickly with the band, which is one of the things I really prefer doing. Because for me personally, I love creative speed in the studio. I also enjoy being tweaky about things, but I recognize that when I go there, a different thing happens. But there's something magical that can happen about working really quickly in the studio, being, and again, that speaks to things like when you're mixing, do your prep work ahead of time separately from the creative mixing.
Absolutely.
So that you can mix quickly in that moment. But one of the things that can be challenging about working quickly with the music, the recording process, especially if the writing's happening in the studio, is arrangement mistakes slip through the cracks.
Mm-hmm.
Like the guitar doesn't always know, and some of it has to do with the fact that the part hasn't been invented yet. So,
hasn't been flushed out. Yeah.
well, or just it hadn't been, it never existed until,
Right.
the overdub stage.
Right.
So like maybe the guitar that happens in the tracking was a pretty cool idea, but this overdub that came along later with the keyboard is a really cool idea, but it doesn't quite jive with the guitar anymore because they're playing fighting parts.
Right.
So that can be a challenge too. And what are some of the things that if that sounds familiar to you, what are some of the options that we have for sorting through that when we do have a good recording, but maybe the arrangement ideas weren't quite all the way there?
Yeah. So for me, I don't have a lot of that luxury because what I get, the recording and the productions are done. So I'm mixing what I'm getting. What I don't do here, and a lot of studios do, I just don't happen to do it in mine, is that, sometimes, producers will add parts at the mixing stage. They'll move parts around in the session. They'll prearrange. That's not typically what I do, but there are options around that. And that's the beauty of digital, is we could take a Pro Tools session now or a Logic session and we can rearrange the parts in the song if we want to. We want to. We couldn't do that back in the day.
Especially if we're in MIDI land.
Oh yeah, like if you're using, software drums and software, synths and pianos and stuff. Oh yeah, for sure. So that you can do that stuff, but I don't typically do that because by the time it gets to me, that stuff's already been pretty much flushed out. But I also think if you're doing everything yourself, then again, I think you just said it a minute ago, I try to separate. That's not, there's production and there's pre-production and there's writing and arranging or production work, and then there's mixing. And I think of those as two entirely different processes. Although I do know there's a lot of people that it's all in one. They wear all the hats and it's all done at the same time. That's just not my particular workflow.
Mm-hmm.
I would be, if I was writing my own songs and then going to mix my own songs, that would be like a total, for my brain, it would be a total different way of thinking. I wouldn't be even thinking about mixing until I had all that other stuff flushed out and making sure that all the arrangements and the recordings and the parts are all there. And that's more, the way I think of it, that's more of a producer of what you're doing when you're producing music, as opposed to just mixing the record at that point.
Now, when you are at the mix stage and it's already been produced and you say you've got what you got, do you find that sometimes the smart move, I think when we first start mixing, we think, in order to get a good mix, I have to make sure that you can hear every single one of these parts in the mix, like you're like, gotta just hear just enough of everything. And what's funny is you discover that you end up with this like perfect gray. It's like you try and balance everything so you you can hear just enough of everything, and then you're like, oh wait, this doesn't sound like anything now. It just sounds like mush. It doesn't have dynamic.
Yeah. So one of the things that I try to that will happen quite frequently, and again, one of the benefits to digital, and at the same time it's a curse, is we have a limited amount of tracks. So we can have 7 pairs of room microphones on the drums because we can. Why not? So I'll get a session that has 100 tracks in it, and it could be a really dense mix, live band, big rock track, right? Well, the first thing I'm listening for is what stuff can we eliminate? Can we eliminate? And again, this is some of the benefits of analog. I got a 32-channel console. If I have 100 tracks, we're going to do a lot of comping in the box, or we're going to eliminate a bunch of stuff. And so what I find too is, so you don't have that problem where it just sounds like a big thing of mush. Well, what's absolutely essential and important? Do we need to have a snare drum and then 7 samples layered on top of it with slate trigger? I know people do that, and that's cool. You get some really cool sounds. But again, I think more old school and organic. And I go, we don't need that. We need a snare. Let's add a sample to augment it or embellish it. These other 5, they're choices depending on the song. We don't need the other 5.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about live musicians, and we get down to drum kit, bass, guitars, keys, vocals, background vocals, we can get all of that more or less within 30 tracks, 35 tracks. And now when you've taken that 100-track session and you've pared it down and you've gotten rid of and muted some of the things that aren't essential to the song, some of that muddiness or that grayness you talked about, all of a sudden starts to go away and things become a little bit more clear, because we're not trying to jam, what do they say, 10 pounds of shit in a 5-pound bag anymore,
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some of that could be beneficial too. Just because we have unlimited recording or we can record 150 tracks doesn't mean that we should. It's fun to do. And I understand that a lot of people will do that because they want to have choices at mixing. So we want to have 7 pairs of room microphones because we want to be able to sit around for a day and a half and try to choose which pair or 2 do we want to use. But I don't know. For me, that's just not my style. It works for lots of people, and I'm sure that, that's the way a lot of records are made today. I really try to do a way more simpler approach. If I'm recording a drum kit, we're not putting 25 microphones on the drum kit.
Yeah.
We're not.
What are some so what advice do you typically give, somebody with a home studio? What would you say to the rock stars who've are just like, okay, I just need to figure out like what's a good way to mic up my drum kit in my home studio?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm in the middle of recording a course for that'll be coming out in the summer. But recording drums it's called Recording Drums Made Easy, and it is in a home bedroom studio with not purpose-built big tall ceilings, big rooms, regular room in normal houses. How do I get something that sounds really great? We don't need a $5,000 DW custom maple. We can just use a really, a less than $1,000 drum kit, basic microphone. So the way I tell
one.
Yeah, me too. And so I go, let's use the staples that are tried and true that you've heard on 10 million records, right? We're going to have a couple of SM57s for maybe snare top, snare bottom. We're going to have something like a Shure, an AKG kick drum mic, the D112 or the Beta 52. Again, these are all in the affordable range. We don't need to go skyrocket in price, although you could if you want to, but trying to keep things for the home studio guy or gal that's on a budget, right? You can get some either Shure or Audix kind of tom microphones, and I'll close top snare, top bottom, rack, tom mic, kick drum, kick in. If I have an extra mic laying around, maybe a kick out, but we don't always need that.
Yeah, the kick out is a funny mic. I don't know how often I always use it.
And then a pair of overheads. And if you have the room, if you're working in a bedroom studio, a room mic probably doesn't serve much of a purpose. But if you're working in a basement or a garage where maybe you want to stick could be anything, a large diaphragm condenser across the room for a room mic choice, that's it. So I use maybe 6 to 8 microphones on a drum kit for a home studio. And with that, good recordings, right? Good playing, good recordings with also the benefits of things like Slate Trigger, where we can add some samples or we can duplicate tracks and add some samples to give it a little bit more of a larger than life sound. Those are some of the tools that are great for home studio users that don't have the ability to go into a big live room that have all the microphones at their disposal, will have all those choices.
Yeah.
And you can get some really, really great drum sounds with just simple stuff.
This podcast is proud to present Recording Studio Rockstars Academy. Are you ready to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level and make your best record ever? Then visit the Academy to find the course that's right for you. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Then check out Rockstars of Drums to learn how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a professional Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Or if you're ready to start mastering your own records at home, then check out Rockstars of Mastering, where I walk you through exactly how I master my own records using nothing but plugins. Plus, I take you into a world-class mastering studio, Sterling Sound, to meet with Ryan Smith and hear how he professionally mastered my record, Skadoosh, for release to streaming platforms. That's the music you hear on this podcast, Rockstars. And if mixing is your focus, then check out my free mixing course, Mix Master Bundle, where I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins and Pro Tools. Plus, you get a look at how I recorded everything in my studio and multi-track downloads for you to practice mixing and even upload to your website if you want. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy to get started now. One of the videos that's on your channel is called Recording Drums with Slate Digital ML.
Yeah, I think that just came out. Yeah, it came out this week. Yeah,
I think that was a new one. And I don't know if I got to the part where you might have tried this, but Al Evans, who's been a guest on the podcast, he taught me just such a cool, fun way to record drums with one mic too, where you just take the mic and you just stick it right in between the kick drum and the snare drum. So it's like right there. It's almost like a couple of inches above where the beater hits the kick. And, if you get that balanced just right, or maybe you use some compression and limiting tastefully, God, you can get such a cool drum sound that way.
Yeah, in that particular video, we did one mic, and then I played along to a track, and we brought it after the fact into our DAW, and we were testing all the different Slate mic models, which again, that's another wonderful for people on a budget. Like if someone, well, I don't have a lot of microphones, I don't have the money for a big time mic locker. I mean, I will say that, you know, and again, I bought that with my own money. Slate didn't send it to me. That is a wonderful product for the money. For $500, and then you get some of the mic model packs that come with it, and you can really change the sound of that microphone quite dramatically. And they sound really good. And when at the end of the video, when I blended it into the track that I played to, you almost couldn't believe it was only one microphone. It was like, it really sat with the track really well. It was all about the mic placement, the experimentation, which is key. But then more importantly, with one microphone, and I talked about in the video, is really the being aware of how you're physically playing the drums when you're only recording with one mic. And they call that, what they call that, drummers will call that self-mixing. I think I've heard people call it, where they're very aware of how hard they're hitting the cymbals and how hard they're hitting the drums, and because of that one microphone and where it is in relationship to the drum kit, and making sure that we get a nice balance, because once it's recorded, you can do some EQ things and some compression things, but there are some limitations. But the whole point of that video is just to show, if you only had one microphone, and it doesn't have to be a very expensive microphone, if you take the time to experiment with the mic placement to find out where your kit sounds good, and you have good drum heads, and you tune your drums, and you're aware of your playing, you could get something that's very usable, very, very usable, very usable.
You can get something even that sounds better than when you mic'd it up with a whole ton of mics.
Because
I had that experience just recently even.
Yeah, because when you use a bunch of microphones, there's all kinds of issues that crop up. There are phasing issues and all kinds of things that kind of get in the way. Mic bleed, and you know, when you're doing multiple mics on a drum kit, you know, there are a lot of techniques and engineering things you want to know to get that too. Sometimes, you know, sometimes less is more. You know, so yeah.
So speaking of which, we're going to get to our closing question here.
Sure.
But before we do, you've mentioned a bunch of cool, affordable things. And I just want to give a shout out, Rockstars. Now I know you have on your videos, there's always a link to all the products you're talking about. Yeah. And there's a link to your Sweetwater page there. So I would just want to encourage you, Rockstars, if you're digging all the stuff David's talking about and you end up over on his channel, if it's fair to say this, please click through on his Sweetwater link, and it'll take you there so you can go, you know, browse around, and anything you get is going to come back to help his channel and help him keep
much appreciated. And I always thank so many people do that. I never thought so many people would buy stuff through my links, but they do. And it really does help, because as we talked about, doing these YouTube videos and stuff take an enormous amount of time. Yeah. And I'm not a really big channel. I'm not the who's a good my friend and love. I'm not the Warren Hewitts of the world. I don't have 1 million subscribers, you know, so I'm making pennies when it comes to ad money and that kind of thing. So anything that people do, it helps out a lot, and it really does, you know, allow me to continue to put out this content. So I really appreciate that stuff, you know.
Sure, and maybe if you send it over, we can include that in the show notes as well.
Sure, that would be great. Thank you.
You can just scroll down, Rockstars. So let me ask you this question. This is our hypothetical question, and we really appreciate you being here, man. This is fun hanging out with you.
No, I love it. Thank you.
I like your style, and I also like the cool sound of your, you know, New England voice up there in Connecticut. You're just a great storyteller. You got that.
Thank you.
You might not be in New York, but you sound close to New York.
Yeah, my parents were born in New York, so you know, that's what it is. Yeah.
Sweet. All right, so we're going to take the Wayback Studio machine, and you're going to go back in time, and you're going to find young David, and you say, "Listen, man, I've come back to give you this one bit of advice. I know you want to be a rock star of the studio one day, but here's the single most important thing you need to know." What advice would you like to go back and give yourself if you could?
Advice you need to know is being in the studio, being a success in the studio business or in the music business in general.
It's your choice, whether it's music biz, studio stuff, or just how to make a great sounding record.
Well, you know, if it was one piece of advice, I say be open-minded, and don't hold too precious your beliefs of the way things should be done. And as you develop more in your skill set, don't think you know everything, because you don't know everything. And we always remember that there's a million people that are way more experienced and better at it than you are. And then as you get better, you're also better than, there's a lot of people behind you and there's a lot of people in front of you. And you're always learning. And even though I'm an educator, I always say to my channels, especially when we talk about the analog stuff, I'm constantly learning and I'm constantly training, and I'm watching guys like you, and I'm watching my favorite mixers, and I'm always learning. I don't know it all. I don't even know a fraction. I don't, so be open-minded and listen and then once you start to know some stuff, pay it forward and pass it backwards. Because we live in an age now where you could get this information. When we were coming up, the only way you can learn this stuff is you had to be an intern. You had to be lucky enough to get in a studio and get in, be a good hang and be a good person and be friendly and all those soft skills. And hopefully someone would teach you some of these folklore things, but now you have access to the information. So help out people that are coming up behind you. And that's really what I try to do, because I wish I had these resources when I was first coming up, man.
Yeah.
I probably would have been a lot more successful. It took way too many years to learn all this stuff,
I know. That's basically why I started the podcast too. It's the same feeling. I mean, I felt really lucky to be able to move to a place like this, go to a school for it, have internships and be in studios, but with everything changing, I just thought it would be really cool to just bring those studio stories to everybody everywhere
and help people, because there's, we need, as we're moving on in our careers, there's always people that are coming up, and I get asked all the time about how do you do this? And now it's with the advent of the internet and stuff. A lot of people want to know, well, how do you do this at home? How do you do this out of your house? There is no studios in my area I can go work at, if I don't live in Nashville or if I don't live in LA, how do I do this on my own? So I try to teach a lot of that too to people, how you don't have to live. It's preferable. I would wish I lived in the middle of Nashville, but I don't. And you can still make a living doing this with the internet if you know what you're doing. You can still be found.
Well, and the other thing that's cool that I dig about your channel and what I try to bring through Recording Studio Rockstars is, sure, we have the internet and we have YouTube, but there's also so much flashy soundbitey stuff out there that is almost distracting. It's almost like I can't retain the knowledge sometimes. I really like the sort of like I said, down to earth approach where we're really just relaxing into it. Like let's really talk about some stuff and let's learn some stuff. So
just anyway, like we're sitting in a room together,
Exactly. So Rockstars, thank you for listening. Thanks for hanging with us. David, it's a pleasure to see you again, man.
Same here.
Let the Rockstars know a couple of things. One is, where would you like them to go to find you? A reminder. And two is, I don't even know specifically what it is, but I'm quite certain you got some cool free stuff out there for everybody.
Oh,
as well.
yeah, absolutely. So if you want a couple of things, you want to find me and you want something for free, just go to homerecordingmadeeasy.com. So we're talking a lot about mixing today. Right on the homepage is the free $100 mixing course. It's about 2 hours long. It's an intro to the whole course is based around just using your stock EQ, your stock compressor. Very easy way in. If you're new to mixing or someone who wants to brush up on some of your skills, that's where you want to go. And then all my whole online training curriculum is on that website. And if you get the free course, you'll be on my email list, and twice a month throughout the whole year, I'm always putting my courses on sale only for people that are on my email list, and they get anywhere from 30 to 50% off selective courses. So I tell people, if you come to me and you follow me, don't ever pay full price for a course, because you won't have to. If you're willing to wait it out, you'll get a discount or something. And I'm always doing stuff for my email VIP members, and it doesn't cost you anything to be on that list. Just
right on, man.
Go there and check it out.
Awesome, dude. Well, thank you again for hanging with us, David. I look forward to coming and seeing your studio sometime.
Yeah, it would be great, man. I would love to have you.
Nice, I went to school for a couple of years in Connecticut, actually.
Oh, what school?
I was at Kent School.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Very good school.
On the Housatonic. Yeah, it was a little too good for me. I got kicked out. Yeah. But that was good. It was the beginning of my rock and roll path, and here I am now, many years later. So, dude, good to see you, man.
Same here.
Thanks for hanging with us, Rockstars. Thanks for listening. And Dave, we'll see you around the studio, dude.
Yeah, man. Thank you again.
All right, man. Cheers.
See ya.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our awesome sponsors who help make this episode possible: Lewitt, Atom Audio, Native Instruments, Isotope, Spectra 1964, and OWC. And remember, at isotope.com and nativeinstruments.com, use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off any plugin purchase. If you enjoyed Recording Studio Rockstars, please check out our sponsors using the links in our show notes, because it's a great way to help support this show. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're going to help you make your best record ever. I would also like to thank our fantastic team here at Recording Studio Rockstars: Vlad Weselchenko, Braden Stremming, Liz Hulitskaya, and Roberto Oxman de Aragao for additional podcasts and video help. Thanks so much for listening, Rockstars, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.